What if the most important chapter of human history was not buried beneath sand or stone or ice, but beneath certainty itself? What if the silence between the first myths and the first official records is not empty at all, but crowded with something forgotten, something broken off so completely that later civilizations mistook the wound for a beginning? And so, before the listener lets the body sink fully into this softness, this dim and drifting hour, they're invited to like the video and subscribe, but only if this quiet work truly earns a place in their night. They are also invited to share their location and local time, as if to leave one small mark in the dark, before the story turns toward all the marks that vanished. History has always seemed most confident where it is most incomplete. It speaks in dates, dynasties, migrations, empires, inventions. It arranges the human story into a line that appears clean from a distance, as though one age simply opened into the next, and one people handed the torch to another in orderly succession. Yet the deeper one listens, the more that line begins to tremble. There are silences in it that feel too large. There are absences that seem less like ordinary loss, and more like the edges of something carefully smoothed away. There are beginnings that arrive already carrying the weight of forgotten time, as if civilization did not awaken slowly from nothing, but emerged blinking from a room whose walls had been built long before anyone now living could remember. The oldest written words do not greet the modern world like the first breath of intelligence. They arrive already surrounded by memory. The earliest kings of Mesopotamia did not describe themselves as standing at the dawn of all things. Egyptian priests spoke of sacred ages that stretched behind them like a river vanishing into mist. Greek philosophers inherited ruins of thought whose origins they could not fully name. Across cultures, the pattern repeats with a strange, quiet persistence. The ancients themselves often believed they were late, not early. They did not always imagine themselves as founders. Sometimes they seemed to think they were survivors. That detail lingers longer than it should. It rests in the mind like a stone beneath shallow water. If the peoples closest to antiquity carried such strong intuitions of prior worlds, then what exactly had they inherited? Were they merely doing what human beings have always done, wrapping uncertainty in myth and reverence? Or were they preserving in distorted form the afterimage of something real? Older systems of knowledge, older landscapes of settlement, older collapses so severe that only fragments floated forward into legend. Modern archaeology has revealed enough to deepen the unease without settling it. Entire prehistoric ceremonial sites have been found where no one once expected complexity. Settlements far older than conventional imagination once allowed have been uncovered beneath layers of earth, ash, or urban construction. Human footprints across continents now appear earlier, more adaptive, and more enigmatic than earlier models preferred. The old picture of primitive people wandering in a state of near mental sleep, waiting patiently for civilization to begin, has been fading for decades. In its place, there emerges a more difficult image, one of humans who are already symbol makers, navigators, builders, mourners, artists, and rememberers long before the official curtain rose. And still, even that revised picture may be too neat, because evidence does not survive in proportion to importance. The most decisive things in human life are often the least likely to fossilize. A worldview leaves no skeleton. A way of arranging time disappears with the tongue that spoke it. A sacred geometry traced in wood, reed, pigment, cloth, or memory can vanish more completely than a broken pot. A city built on a coastline swallowed after the Ice Age will not introduce itself easily to the future. A library burned in one generation becomes in another a rumour. A tradition suppressed for centuries returns only as superstition. Even a catastrophe can erase itself if those who survive it no longer possess the means to describe what was lost. This is where the shape of the missing chapter begins to shift. It may not be one lost empire, one sunken kingdom, one forbidden archive waiting dramatically beneath desert stone. Human disappointment has often been fed by such fantasies. The deeper possibility is quieter, and for that reason perhaps more unsettling. Perhaps the missing chapter is not a single chapter at all, but a torn-out section of the human story composed of many worlds. Coastal worlds drowned by rising seas, inland worlds shattered by drought, ritual worlds absorbed into later religions, intellectual worlds condemned by orthodoxy, and memory worlds thinned by time until only symbols remained. Perhaps what is missing is not a place, but a continuity. There is something almost painful in that idea, not because it demands belief in wild impossibilities, but because it asks for a simpler admission that the human past may have suffered breaks more profound than the modern mind likes to imagine. It is comforting to believe that knowledge accumulates like stone laid upon stone. It is less comforting to wonder whether knowledge also burns, sinks, freezes, scatters, and is born again in altered names. Civilizations enjoy seeing themselves as heirs to an upward movement. They are less willing to see themselves as heirs to repeated forgetting, and forgetting has always had allies. Nature is the first of them. Ice advances, rivers abandon their courses, coastlines retreat, forests consume walls, earthquakes swallow foundations. Volcanic ash seals one life and erases another. The sea is especially patient. During the end of the last ice age, shorelines across the world moved inland as waters rose over generations and centuries. Today, the continental shelves that lie beneath shallow seas were once exposed landscapes, walked, hunted, inhabited, perhaps loved. If early communities flourished there, if myths were born there, if experimental forms of settlement or seafaring matured there, then one of humanity's great archives now lies beneath waters that arrive too slowly for legend to preserve with precision, and too thoroughly for history to recover with ease. But nature is not the only keeper of absence. Powers always organized memory. What is taught is curated. What is copied survives. What is declared heretical thins out. What is politically useful becomes heritage, while what is inconvenient becomes folklore, error, rumour, blasphemy, barbarism. The destruction of records is not merely an accident of fire and conquest. Sometimes it is the method by which a new order makes itself appear inevitable. A temple falls, and with it the calendar it kept. A priesthood is replaced, and with it an account of origins. A conquered people is allowed to live, but not to narrate. Later generations inherit a polished surface and call it truth, unaware of how much scraping it took to make the stone look smooth. Perhaps that is why certain myths continue to trouble the edges of official history. Flood myths, lost ages, teachers from nowhere, cities swallowed whole, sacred knowledge handed down after disaster. These stories are easy to dismiss when taken literally, and perhaps many of them should not be read as records in any simple sense. Yet it is harder to ignore how often they circle the same emotional core. Something valuable existed, something terrible interrupted it, and what remains must be pieced together from fragments. Even where the details differ, the mood is strangely consistent. It is the mood of inheritance after damage. That mood may say more about humanity than any date carved into stone. The species remembers itself not only through monuments, but through recurring griefs. It dreams of lost gardens, fallen towers, former harmonies, vanished laws. Even in the most rational ages there remains a strange hunger for the thought that something essential was once known, and has since been obscured. Sometimes that hunger leads to fantasy. Sometimes it leads to distortion. But sometimes, perhaps, it leads toward a wound that is real, even if the stories told around it are imperfect. So the question is not whether every dramatic theory deserves belief. Most do not. The question is more restrained and more dangerous. What if the accepted structure of history is accurate only in outline, while its deepest transitions remain misnamed? What if the first great human chapter was not the invention of writing, or the rise of cities, but an older threshold now barely visible, a chapter of adaptation, memory, experimentation, symbolism and collapse that shaped everything after it while leaving almost no intact face behind. What if the foundations of civilization were already ruins by the time civilization learned how to write its name? And if that were true, then what else in the long human story has been mistaken for a beginning, simply because the evidence of what came before was too broken, too drowned, too burned, or too carefully erased to speak clearly anymore? If the first wound in history is silence, then the second is the strange way silence survives. It does not remain empty for long. It gathers stories around itself. It attracts priests, chroniclers, kings and scholars, each laying a careful hand over the gap, each giving it shape, order and explanation. Over time, the missing place begins to look less like a rupture and more like a natural beginning. Children are taught where the story starts. Civilizations learn which ancestors to honour. Empires name themselves the rightful heirs of all that matters. And so, the oldest absence in human memory is not simply left behind. It is covered, translated, domesticated. It becomes easier to live with once it has been renamed. Yet memory has always been more fragile than stone, and often more revealing. Before writing, before royal inscriptions, before the bureaucratic confidence of ledgers and monuments, human beings carried the past in voice, ritual, repetition, and place. A coastline was remembered in the way a path curved toward water. A season was remembered in the timing of birds. An ancestor was remembered in a song. A disaster was remembered in the warning not to build too close to a certain valley, not to trust a certain river, not to ignore the sky when it turned a particular shade. None of this would have looked like history to a modern archive, and yet it may have been the truest history a people possessed. That kind of memory is powerful, but it is also vulnerable. It depends on a living continuity. It must be repeated correctly, or at least repeated often enough to remain recognizable. It needs generations that are not interrupted too violently. It needs landscapes that remain legible. When the land changes beyond recognition, memory loses one of its oldest companions. When the people who carry a tradition are scattered, enslaved, absorbed, converted or killed, the thread thins. What survives is not always the event itself, but the emotional outline of the event. Fear remains after detail is gone. Reverence remains after meaning decays. The ritual persists, but the reason for it becomes missed. This may be one reason why early human history feels less lost than dissolved. It is not only that evidence vanished, it may also be that evidence changed form. A flood became a myth. A migration became a sacred journey. A vanished homeland became paradise, or exile, or the realm of the dead. A real environmental shift became a divine punishment in later retellings, not because ancient people were foolish, but because catastrophe passes through the human mind clothed in the language available to it. When literal memory fails, symbolic memory often takes its place. There is a quiet kind of tragedy in that transformation. Something once known directly becomes something narrated indirectly. The event recedes, but the ache remains. Across continents, one finds traditions of lost lands, former ages, and knowledge once held more fully than it is now. No single story proves anything by itself. Patterns can mislead. The modern imagination is skilled at weaving connections where none exist, and yet repetition has its own gravity. It is difficult not to notice how often human cultures speak, as though they inherited the aftermath of something larger than themselves. The end of the last ice age offers one possible frame for that feeling. It was not a cinematic apocalypse in a single afternoon, but a prolonged transformation of the world. Glaciers retreated, water rose, weather shifted, ecosystems moved, habitable zones changed, coastlines familiar to countless generations slowly disappeared beneath the sea. What had once been ordinary ground became inaccessible. This matters because early humans did not live only in the interior of continents. Like later humans, they were drawn to coasts, estuaries, rivers, and fertile margins, These were routes of movement, places of food, and likely centres of exchange, story, and adaptation. When the shoreline moved, the archive moved with it. Then it drowned. A drowned archive does not announce itself. It does not burn in front of witnesses. It leaves no smoke. It simply withdraws beyond reach while life continues elsewhere. The descendants of those who leave may still remember a place once walked by their elders, but after enough generations, memory loosens. The land is no longer visible to confirm the story. Skeptics emerge. Ritual remains, but geography fades. Eventually a real place becomes a holy place, then a legendary place, and finally a metaphor. This is not deception. It is the natural weathering of truth inside the human mind. Then comes writing, and with it, another transformation. Writing preserves, but it also filters. It gives extraordinary durability to certain versions of reality while excluding others. The earliest literate societies did not record everything equally. They preserved taxes, offerings, victories, laws, genealogies, foundations, celestial observations, religious formulas, and official memory. They did not preserve the entire emotional and ecological life of the species. Many voices never entered script at all. Those who held the stylus were rarely neutral witnesses. They wrote for courts, temples, administrations, and systems of belief. The written record is precious, but it is also selective by design. This is one of history's quietest illusions, that what is written feels more real than what was lived without writing. But an unwritten age is not an empty age. It is merely an age whose truths were stored differently. A fire can erase a manuscript. Time can erase a dialect. Seawater can erase a shoreline. Orthodoxy can erase an interpretation. None of these erasures mean the past was thin. They mean the past was made of materials that did not all survive the same way. Even now, traces appear at the edges, ancient footprints preserved in sediment, ritual burials older than expected, art that suggests symbolic minds already moving in shadows tens of thousands of years ago, submerged structures debated and redated, genetic studies revealing encounters, branches, and dispersals more tangled than earlier models allowed. Every decade seems to complicate the story rather than simplify it. The origin of human complexity recedes the closer it is approached. What seemed once like a clean threshold now resembles a half-seen horizon in fog. Perhaps that is why the missing chapter is so difficult to name. It is not simply before civilization, because that phrase assumes civilization has only one recognizable form. It is not merely prehistory, because that word often hides more than it reveals. It may be better understood as the long era in which humanity became fully human in ways that left uneven marks. Through ritual, distance, memory, grief, navigation, imagination, and survival under conditions later ages could hardly reconstruct. If much of that era has disappeared, then the loss is not only academic, it changes how the species understands its own depth. And once that possibility is admitted, another question begins to form in the dark. If memory can dissolve into myth, if landscapes can vanish beneath water, and if writing can preserve only what power allows it to preserve, then how much of the human past has been mistaken? Not because it was false, but because the forms that carried it were too fragile to survive the journey into official history. There is something unsettling about the sea when it is treated not as scenery, but as memory. On the surface it seems to conceal by nature. It reflects light, swallows sound, smooths over violence, and offers no obvious sign of what lies below. Yet the sea does not only hide, it keeps. It preserves outlines in darkness. It seals roads, hearths, walls, tools, bones, and shorelines beneath layers of silt and pressure. It does not erase the past in quite the same way fire does. Fire destroys openly. The sea is more patient. It covers the evidence and waits for a future intelligence to wonder whether the world once extended farther than the eye can now confirm. That question becomes difficult to ignore once the lost coastlines of prehistory are taken seriously. During the last glacial period, vast quantities of water were locked in ice, sea levels were lower, the shape of the inhabited world was different. Places that are now shallow seabed were once plains, river valleys, marshes, estuaries, and habitable corridors. In many regions, these would not have been marginal lands. They would have been among the most attractive landscapes available to human communities, rich in fish, birds, shellfish, plant life, and movement routes. If later civilizations preferred coasts, there is little reason to imagine earlier humans did not feel the same pull. And if they did, then much of early human life unfolded in territories now absent from the visible map. This possibility carries a strange emotional weight. It suggests that what modern people think of as the stable outlines of the continents are only the latest version of a much older stage set. Entire ecological worlds existed where there is now open water. Families may have raised children there. Rituals may have been performed there. Stories may have first been told there beside shorelines that no longer exist. The earliest experiments with long-distance exchange, boat travel, seasonal gathering, or symbolic placemaking may have unfolded in landscapes now inaccessible, except through sonar, sediment cores, and inference. When those coasts disappeared, the loss was not only geographic, it was civilizational, even if the societies affected were not civilizations in the later monumental sense. This is where the ocean stops being merely a backdrop to history and becomes one of its most consequential sensors. There are clues, though they arrive in fragments. Off the coasts of various regions, archaeologists and marine researchers have identified drowned land surfaces, ancient river channels, submerged tools, possible settlement traces, and indicators of human activity in places now underwater. The details are often technical, disputed, or incomplete. Some discoveries are celebrated too early. Others are overinterpreted by those hungry for lost worlds dramatic enough to satisfy legend. But underneath the exaggerations, one fact remains stubbornly credible. The sea level rise that followed the Ice Age unquestionably drowned immense areas once available to human occupation. That alone is enough to reshape the imagination. It means absence can no longer be read as innocence. The lack of obvious remains on today's land does not necessarily mean early humanity lived without complexity in the drowned margins. It may simply mean the archive was relocated beyond ordinary excavation, before archaeology even existed as a discipline. A species that may have learned crucial lessons on vanished coasts would then appear to later ages as though it had emerged from nowhere inland, stripped of context, carrying mature behaviours whose developmental environments had already been claimed by water. That may help explain why certain transitions in human history often seem abrupt from a distance. Symbolic behaviour appears, then expands. Seafaring capabilities appear, then seem surprisingly competent. Long-distance movement becomes visible across islands and continents. Knowledge of seasonal cycles, animal patterns, star paths, and coastal ecologies appears embedded in later cultures in ways that suggest immense time depth. None of this proves a hidden global civilization. That word is often used too carelessly, but it does raise a quieter question. How much formative human experience took place in landscapes that can no longer testify for themselves? The sea may also have done something subtler than conceal evidence. It may have transformed memory itself. A mountain remains visible after a people is displaced. A forest can still be pointed to. A ruined wall can still be revisited. But a drowned homeland is different. It slips beyond confirmation. Those who remember it cannot return in the same way. Their children inherit description without reference. Their grandchildren inherit reverence without map. In time, the lost shore becomes a story not because it was invented, but because it can no longer be touched. This is how geography begins to soften into myth. Perhaps this is why so many traditions across the world retain emotional traces of lands beyond present reach, submerged realms, sacred western horizons, ancestral islands, or worlds swallowed after human wrongdoing or cosmic disorder. These traditions are not all records of literal sea level rise, and it would be simplistic to treat them as direct geological testimony. Human storytelling is more layered than that, yet the recurrence remains haunting. It suggests that the movement of water through the ancient world did more than redraw coastlines. It changed how communities imagined origins, exile, punishment, inheritance, and return. There is also a deeper irony at work. The earliest humans capable of navigating coasts, observing tides, and moving along marine corridors may have been more sophisticated in their environmental understanding than many later societies gave them credit for. To live on thresholds between land and sea requires attentiveness. It requires memory of cycles, storms, currents, migrations, shoals, moons, and seasons. It requires a form of intelligence not always visible in stone ruins. The modern mind, trained to recognize grandeur in masonry and script, often underestimates the sophistication of those who built knowledge into movement rather than into monuments. But if the most important chapter of human history involved learning how to inhabit unstable worlds, then the greatest archive of that intelligence may now be underwater, and what lies underwater is difficult not only to find but to interpret. Marine archaeology is expensive, slow, technologically demanding, and often partial. Sediment moves, organic material decays, structures can be natural, modified, or impossible to classify with certainty. Public fascination tends to swing between indifference and sensationalism, leaving careful work in an awkward position. The result is a peculiar modern condition. Humanity may know in principle that immense portions of its past were drowned, while still lacking the cultural patience to pursue what that admission really means. What it might mean is unsettlingly simple. The visible record of early humanity could be inland residue. The surviving fragments may not represent the whole pattern, but only what water failed to take. If so, then historians are not standing at the beginning of the story at all. They are standing on high ground after a flood, arranging the objects left behind and mistaking survival for origin. Once that thought takes hold, even the calm surface of the sea begins to feel altered. It is no longer only beautiful or dangerous or immense. It becomes archival. It becomes accusatory. It suggests that the human story may have been rehearsed for thousands of years in places now beyond easy reach, and that later history inherited skills, fears, symbols, and perhaps even forms of social organization from worlds whose coastlines are gone. If the water swallowed the first great margins of human becoming, then perhaps the missing chapter was not hidden in secret vaults or forbidden temples at all. Perhaps it has been lying in plain darkness all along, beneath shipping lanes and tides, waiting for someone to ask whether the silence at the beginning of history sounds, faintly, like waves. If the sea keeps what it has taken, the land keeps something else. Interruptions. Not all of them are dramatic. Some appear as stones arranged with an intelligence that seems to arrive too early. Some appear as alignments no one expected from communities once dismissed as simple. Some emerge from hills that turn out not to be hills, or from sanctuaries whose age unsettles the sequence of accepted beginnings. And so the old confidence returns, though now in a different form. If whole human worlds may lie underwater beyond ordinary reach, then what remains on land begins to look less like the full architecture of the past, and more like scattered high points of a submerged continent of memory. There is a danger here, and it has misled many minds. The danger is to turn every mystery into proof of impossible things. Stones weather, myths accumulate, and human longing is fully capable of inventing golden ages grand enough to console every disappointment of the present. Yet there is another danger, quieter and often more respectable. It is the reflex to shrink every anomaly until it no longer disturbs the established order. Between fantasy and dismissal lies a more difficult posture, to remain still long enough for the evidence to keep its strangeness without forcing it into spectacle. Few places embody that tension more deeply than the earliest monumental sites. Once, history preferred a clean arrangement. First came survival, then agriculture, then villages, then hierarchy, then temples, calendars, cities, writing, kings. The pattern had a satisfying logic. It suggested that complexity ripened slowly and predictably, that spiritual symbolism and large-scale construction were luxuries of settled life. But then certain sites began to unsettle that neat ladder. Massive ritual enclosures appeared older than expected. Symbolic sophistication emerged in contexts not yet fully urban. The hand that carved, aligned, remembered, and gathered large communities for sacred purposes seemed to have awakened earlier than the older model allowed. This does not mean scholars know less than before. In many ways, they know more, but what they know now is less comfortable. Monumentality may not have followed social complexity as obediently as once imagined. Symbolic life may not have been a decorative addition to subsistence. It may have been one of the engines that organised human beings long before the bureaucratic city took shape. The sacred, the ceremonial, the cosmological, the communal act of building toward an invisible meaning. These may have stood much closer to the foundation of the human story than the old materialist simplifications admitted. That possibility casts a strange light over the stones. A carved pillar does not merely prove labour, it proves intention extended through time. It implies planning, cooperation, memory, symbolic agreement, and the authority to gather bodies toward a purpose larger than immediate hunger. When such things appear early, the old image of humanity as half asleep in the long prelude to civilization becomes harder to sustain. One begins to wonder how many thresholds had already been crossed long before writing arrived to certify them. Perhaps the most important chapter of human history was not the moment humans first built cities of mud brick and law, but the much older moment they first learned to gather around meanings too large to hold in one mind alone. And yet the anomalies do not end with monuments. They continue in patterns of transmission that are difficult to map with certainty. Certain architectural forms appear far apart in geography and time, sometimes with no simple line of contact visible. Certain symbolic motifs recur in altered guises across cultures that should, at least at first glance, seem too distant to share such internal grammar. Solar alignments, sacred mountains, world trees, serpent forms, flood memories, houses of the dead arranged like homes for the living. None of these patterns prove a hidden master culture. Human beings can arrive independently at similar shapes of meaning. But when symbols persist across ruptures, the question becomes sharper. Are they convergences of mind or remnants of inheritance? Are they eternal structures of imagination or broken echoes of very old continuities that survive even where explanation has been lost? This is where the missing chapter begins to feel less like a place and more like a buried method of seeing. Because perhaps what later civilizations inherited was not always a direct archive of facts, but a way of orienting themselves to the sky, to death, to number, to repetition, to sacred space. Knowledge does not travel only in texts. It travels in gestures, ratios, building customs, pilgrimage routes, ritual prohibitions, burial habits, story patterns, star names, musical intervals, and inherited intuitions about where meaning is supposed to dwell. A people may forget why a structure must face a particular direction and still preserve the rule. A civilization may continue a pattern after losing the worldview that first gave it life. In such cases, continuity survives in form after explanation has died. This is not speculation without restraint. Historians and archaeologists have long wrestled with the persistence of cultural forms whose origins lie farther back than their surviving justifications. The difficulty is that inherited patterns rarely travel intact. They fracture, merge, are reinterpreted, are absorbed into conquest, religion, trade, and migration. What arrives in one age as sacred architecture may have begun in another as astronomy or mourning, or territorial memory, or a response to catastrophe. The surface meaning changes, The structure remains. Later generations call it tradition. Earlier generations may have called it survival. Then there is the question of skill itself. The ancient world often appears suddenly competent. Not omniscient, not supernatural, but competent in ways that do not sit easily with the assumption of perpetual beginners. Stone is cut with patience accumulated over generations. Orientation to solstices is refined through long observation. Seafaring routes are not discovered in a single bold voyage, but stabilized through repeated returns, errors, and remembered currents. Agriculture, likewise, is not only invention but intimacy with cycles. Wherever one looks closely, the decisive transitions of humanity seem less like sparks from nowhere, and more like the visible crest of much older waves. That image matters. If later history mostly preserves the crest, then the body of the wave has been lost. What stands before the modern eye as a sudden flowering may actually be the final visible moment of processes too old, too fragile, or too poorly preserved to remain fully legible. The chapter that matters most may therefore be the chapter least likely to survive in complete form, the one in which scattered humans learned to become historical beings before history had acquired the means to remember them. Power, too, complicates what is seen. Once monumental centres rise, they create the illusion that meaning was born there. Capitals present themselves as origins. Empires call themselves the axis of order. Priesthoods sanctify their own genealogies. Every durable centre pulls the past toward itself and says, in effect, this is where the real story begins. Yet stone can inherit as easily as it invents. A temple built in 1 millennium may stand on a sacred site venerated for thousands of years before the surviving masonry. A formal cosmology may absorb older local meanings while erasing their names. The victor writes the inscription, but the ground beneath the inscription may already have been holy before the victor arrived. This is why ancient monuments often feel double. They are both present and absent, legible and mute. They tell the truth of the culture that preserved them, but perhaps also conceal truths older than themselves. They stand like official statements built over whispers. One can admire their documented history while sensing that documentation is not the whole of what stands there. A stone circle, a mound, a buried sanctuary, a foundation aligned to a star path. It may all belong to the visible chapter, but it may also point backward into the missing one. And once that possibility is admitted, another unease begins to gather. If some of humanity's oldest surviving monuments are not clean beginnings but inherited summits built over deeper strata of forgotten practice, then how many firsts in history are not first at all? How many thresholds that textbooks present as sudden achievements were really late expressions of knowledge already ancient, already damaged, already passing from one broken world into the next? What if the breaks in history were not only intellectual but physical? What if the missing chapter did not fade gently into obscurity, but was struck, flooded, frozen, scorched, or starved until memory itself became difficult to carry? By the time later civilizations began arranging the past into respectable sequences, they may already have been living in the long shadow of earlier interruptions. The story would then feel smooth, only because the roughest edges had already been worn down by survival. Modern people often imagine catastrophe in theatrical terms, a single day, a single blast. A wall of water rising against a helpless skyline. But the ancient world was not always broken in ways dramatic enough to leave one clear scar. Sometimes the wound came slowly, and for that reason it reached more deeply. A climate shifts over generations, a fertile corridor dries, herd routes fail, rivers move, forests retreat. Ash spreads over fields, seas rise year after year until a shoreline once treated as permanent becomes a memory. In such circumstances, the most dangerous thing is not always death itself but dislocation. Communities are forced to move, then divide, then adapt under pressure. Knowledge tied to one environment loses its footing in another. Rituals remain, but their original meaning thins. Skills survive unevenly. The past is carried forward, but no longer whole. This may be one reason the earliest chapters of humanity feel less like a clean ascent, and more like a conversation interrupted many times. Geology has slowly forced history to become more humble. There were abrupt cold reversals after warming. There were enormous volcanic eruptions capable of changing skies and harvests far beyond their point of origin. There were regional flood events powerful enough to transform coastlines and drive populations. There were droughts long enough to collapse systems that once appeared stable. None of this guarantees a single global reset of civilization in the dramatic sense favoured by popular mythology. The evidence for that is far more complicated, and often far less absolute than sensational storytelling suggests. But one does not need one worldwide catastrophe to produce deep historical amnesia. Multiple regional catastrophes, spread across millennia, interacting with migration, conflict, disease, and ecological stress, would be more than sufficient to tear continuity again and again. And continuity, once torn often enough, begins to imitate origin. A people rebuilding after loss may look like a people beginning from nothing. Later observers seeing only the rebuilt layer may mistake recovery for invention. This is one of history's quietest deceptions. It turns survivors into founders. It mistakes the latest arrangement of knowledge for its first appearance. It treats interruption as emptiness simply because the interrupted voice no longer speaks in a complete sentence. There is something haunting in the possibility that many of humanity's first known achievements may be first only in the surviving record after disaster. Consider the emotional logic of communities facing recurring environmental upheaval. Under such pressure, people do not preserve everything equally. They preserve what keeps bodies alive, what protects children, what maintains social cohesion, what seems sacred enough to deserve risk. Some techniques vanish because they no longer fit the new land. Some beliefs harden because they helped people endure the old one. Some stories expand because they are easier to transmit than practical detail. An account of how the sea took the Western Plain may become, in later generations, a divine flood sent against corruption. A memory of ash-darkened seasons may become a tale of the sun withdrawing its favour. A real collapse is rarely inherited as a laboratory report. It is inherited as moral structure, sacred warning, and image. This does not make the inheritance false, it makes it human. There are ancient memories that seem to tremble with this kind of transformation. Flood traditions appear across widely separated cultures, though never in exactly the same form. Stories of ages ending recur with unsettling persistence. In some traditions, the world is renewed after fire, in others after water, in others after cosmic disorder, celestial misalignment, or divine displeasure. To read these stories only literally is naive. To dismiss them entirely is also perhaps too easy. Between literalism and contempt lies another possibility, that myth is often what catastrophe becomes after it has passed through generations of grief, ritual, compression, and reinterpretation. If so, then myth may not preserve events in documentary detail, but it may preserve the emotional truth that earlier worlds were lost, and that the survivors felt the loss as something more than ordinary change. They felt it as the ending of an age. This is where the idea of reset becomes more subtle and more credible. Not necessarily a single vanished super-civilization, annihilated in one spectacular moment, but repeated reductions of human complexity, repeated fragmentations, repeated falls from local mastery into dispersal. History, under this view, is not a staircase rising without interruption. It is a coastline after storms, rebuilt, eroded, rebuilt again. What survives into official chronology may therefore represent only the most recent stable layer, while below it lie older attempts, partial achievements, and broken continuities. Even in later recorded history, the pattern is familiar. Great systems collapse, roads fall out of use, literacy contracts, long-distance exchange narrows, techniques once common become rare, sacred centres are abandoned, future peoples settle among ruins and invent explanations for what they no longer know how to make. If this can happen in literate, state-based civilizations whose remains still stand above ground, how much more severe could the effect have been in earlier eras, whose archives were oral, coastal, perishable, or scattered? The missing chapter may therefore be missing not because it lacked importance, but because importance itself offered no protection against loss. A navigation tradition can vanish with a coastline. A cosmology tied to stars and seasons can blur when migration shifts latitude and weather pattern. A monumental site can be swallowed by sand or sea. A lineage of trained memory keepers can be extinguished by famine, conquest, or conversion. Human beings often imagine that what matters most must somehow endure. The past offers little support for that hope, and yet fragments do endure, though often in altered form. Ritual habits detached from their original landscapes, sacred prohibitions whose practical function has been forgotten, architectural orientations preserved by custom long after their first meaning fades, tales of punishment, exile, and renewal, the belief that earlier people possessed greater wisdom, the recurring suspicion that the present is living among remnants rather than beginnings. Across cultures and eras, these fragments gather like charcoal after a fire. They do not reconstruct the house by themselves, but they testify that something burned. There is also a political dimension to catastrophe that later ages rarely admit. After disruption, authority tends to consolidate around whoever can name the disaster, interpret it, and organize survival. New religious frameworks arise. Old meanings are absorbed or condemned. Social memory is disciplined. A broken world becomes easier to govern once its past has been simplified. In this sense, every catastrophe risks becoming not only a natural rupture, but a historical opportunity for those who control explanation. What was lost may then disappear twice, first in the event itself, and then in the narrative built afterward. Perhaps this is why the beginning of civilization so often feels already curated. It comes to us not as raw survival, but as a story told by institutions that benefited from presenting themselves as restorers of order. They may well have been exactly that, but restoring order is not the same as preserving total truth. A rebuilt world often edits the ruins it stands upon, so the question darkens. If repeated catastrophes, slow or sudden, local or vast, shattered continuity again and again, then the deepest chapter of human history may not have vanished in a single night. It may have been reduced piece by piece, each interruption taking something different. A coastline, a language, a calendar, a cult, a craft, a way of seeing. And if what modern history calls the beginning is actually what remained after several such reductions, then what exactly was the human world before the reductions began? By the time a lost world becomes a myth, it has already passed through many hands. It has been touched by fear, reverence, politics, forgetting, translation, and the simple erosion of generations. Names shift. Landscapes are moved inward, upward, or beyond the horizon. Human actors become giants, gods, rebels, or culture bringers. A flood is no longer only water. A fire is no longer only heat. The memory of exile becomes theology. The memory of survival becomes ritual. And yet, beneath these transformations, something often remains unexpectedly difficult to silence. The persistent intuition that humanity has come after a break. This intuition appears with peculiar consistency in ancient traditions, not in one culture only, not in one language family, and not always in forms close enough to permit direct borrowing. There are stories of former ages, of worlds renewed after destruction, of sacred knowledge preserved by a few, of hidden lands lost to water, of punishments that resemble ecological disaster, of civilizing figures arriving after a period of disorder. None of these stories should be treated as simple journalism from the remote past, but neither do they feel entirely random. Across enormous distances, human beings again and again told themselves that their present order followed an earlier collapse. Why? One answer is psychological. Human beings are creatures of memory and loss. They grieve not only individuals but conditions. Every society at some level knows rupture. Fields fail, rulers change, cities burn, elders die. It may be natural, then, for cultures to imagine a better, earlier state from which the present has fallen. In this reading, myths of lost ages say more about permanent human dissatisfaction than about literal historical events. They are expressions of longing. They are philosophical mirrors, not broken records of fact. There is truth in that. But perhaps not the whole truth, because myths do not arise in a vacuum. They condense around recurring human experiences, and catastrophe is one of the most recurring of all. A people that has endured flood, displacement, famine, invasion, or the collapse of old order will not preserve that experience in sterile terms. It will become moralized, sacralized, dramatized. The event will gather meanings. The disaster will become connected to cosmic justice or divine warning, not because ancient communities were incapable of analysis, but because suffering of that scale enters the moral imagination almost automatically. Human beings do not merely remember what happened to them, they remember what it felt like it meant. This is what makes ancient myths so difficult and so revealing. They are unreliable as literal transcripts, yet often deeply reliable as emotional fossils. They preserve the structure of an experience even when the details have been transformed. A deluge myth may not preserve the exact hydrology of a real flood, but it may preserve the fact that flood was experienced as civilizational rupture. A tale of a lost golden age may not prove the historical existence of a single exalted kingdom, but it may preserve the sensation that current life is a reduced remnant of something fuller that once existed. A story about knowledge brought by semi-divine teachers may not describe supernatural visitors at all. It may encode the arrival of techniques, cosmologies, or social forms from a source later generations could no longer clearly identify. That possibility grows more compelling when mythic patterns align not with fantasy alone, but with plausible historical pressures. Rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, volcanic eruptions darkening skies, sudden cold reversals, mass migrations, regional collapses, the disappearance of homelands, the replacement of one cultic order by another. These are not inventions. They are part of the real human background. Once admitted, the strange recurrence of destroyed ages and broken continuities begins to feel less ornamental. It begins to feel like memory weathered into symbol. This does not validate every dramatic claim built around ancient myths. Much modern speculation has treated them as a kind of open gate through which any impossibility may pass. Entire pseudo-histories have been constructed by flattening poetic language into literal code. The result is often intellectually careless and emotionally manipulative, but skepticism can become lazy too. To say it is only myth is sometimes another way of refusing to ask what human realities repeatedly generate the same pattern of imagination. Dismissal, in this sense, becomes its own myth. The myth that symbolic narratives have no relationship to lived historical depth. The ancients themselves were often more subtle than their modern interpreters. Greek thinkers debated whether old poetic accounts concealed truth under allegory. Mesopotamian traditions folded royal memory into cosmic narrative without necessarily expecting a modern division between the two. Later religious cultures inherited older stories, reshaped them, and preserved them under new theological structures. In many cases, the myth survived precisely because it was useful enough to adapt. That fact alone should provoke caution. What survives across ages often survives because it can be rewritten without being erased. A story may outlive its original setting by becoming religious doctrine, epic literature, folk memory, sacred warning, or ceremonial drama. In each form something is lost, yet something also remains. And what remains with eerie persistence is the image of interruption. There was once an older order. It failed, or was judged, or was drowned, or was burned, or simply passed beyond reach. A small number preserved what they could. The present world began under diminished conditions, carrying fragments whose meaning was only partly understood. This pattern is so common that one begins to wonder whether it reflects not one historical event, but the recurring human experience of living after fracture. The missing chapter of history in that case may not be one hidden civilization concealed behind official denial. It may be the whole long age in which such fractures happened often enough to shape the species' deepest stories. This would help explain why myths often feel more haunting than chronicles. Chronicles present order after it has been arranged. Myths present the emotional underside of order, the sense that what now exists is provisional, restored, or incomplete. A king list reassures, a flood myth unsettles, a formal genealogy names descent, a lost paradise questions whether descent itself is a kind of falling away. One speaks in the voice of administration, the other in the voice of inherited unease. Perhaps this is why later institutions have so often both preserved and disciplined myth. Religious authorities canonized certain stories while condemning others. Empires tolerated local traditions until those traditions threatened political order. Scholars translated, rationalized, allegorized, or marginalized narratives they could not comfortably accommodate. Myth, after all, is dangerous when it suggests that official history begins too late, or that the current order stands on ruins it prefers not to name. The more a civilization depends on presenting itself as the rightful culmination of the past, the less comfortable it becomes with stories that imply the past was broken in ways no institution fully controls. And still those stories remain, like embers carried from older fires. They remain in the sense that wisdom was greater once, in the idea that sacred knowledge must be recovered rather than invented, in tales of cities beneath water, mountains that remember former heavens, teachers who come after chaos, and worlds remade after judgment. Even when stripped of literal force, these motifs continue to exert pressure. They ask whether humanity has mistaken amnesia for progress. They ask whether the species has confused the neatness of official chronology with the fullness of truth. They ask whether what was lost has survived only in disguised form, folded into ritual, scripture, folklore, architecture, and the quiet suspicion that history's first pages are not missing by accident. If myth is what memory becomes when the ground beneath memory disappears, then perhaps these recurring stories are not distractions from the missing chapter at all. Perhaps they are its last surviving language. And if that is so, then one more question begins to stir beneath them. Who, in later ages, decided which fragments of this deeper memory would be honoured, and which would be smoothed away into silence? If memory survives catastrophe only in fragments, then those fragments do not drift forward untouched. Someone gathers them, someone names them, someone decides which version is worthy of copying, which version belongs in ritual, which version is dangerous, embarrassing, subversive, or simply useless to the order now taking shape. The past does not enter history all at once. It passes through hands, and those hands are rarely innocent. This is one of the quieter truths beneath civilization. Knowledge has always required custodians, and custodians have always exercised power. A temple archive, a royal court, a monastery, a scribal school, a priesthood, a university, an imperial bureau, a colonial museum, a national curriculum, all of them preserve, but all of them also filter. What survives from earlier ages is not only what endured materially, it is what later institutions found meaningful enough, safe enough, or prestigious enough to keep alive. A broken tablet may survive by accident. A worldview survives only if somebody wants it to. This may be why the missing chapter of human history feels not merely lost but managed, Not always through conspiracy in the crude sense, not through a single hidden council suppressing truth across millennia, but through something more ordinary and therefore more durable. Systems of authority shaping memory according to their own needs. A new regime does not need to erase everything. It only needs to decide what counts as real, what counts as sacred, what counts as barbarism, and what counts as noise. Once that process begins, absence acquires a second life. What was once destroyed by flood, fire, migration, or decay can then be destroyed again by interpretation. The ancient world offers many versions of this pattern. Priestly castes kept calendars, genealogies, and sacred formulas not merely as neutral servants of the past, but as guardians of cosmic order as they understood it. Kings sponsored inscriptions that framed victories as destiny, defeats as temporary disorder, and lineage as inevitability. Temples absorbed local traditions into broader cults, preserving some symbols while stripping them of earlier meanings. Conquering empires routinely took over sacred sites, not because they were indifferent to old power, but because they understood its usefulness. The old place remained, but the official story changed. There is something almost architectural in the way civilizations build legitimacy. They do not usually begin on empty ground. They build upon older layers, then claim the visible summit as their own beginning. The foundation remains buried. The later structure becomes authoritative. In time, those who live inside it forget that the basement belonged to another age. This helps explain why so much inherited knowledge appears double. A ritual survives, but its explanation feels late. A monument is preserved, but its official meaning seems narrower than the form itself suggests. A myth is copied into scripture, yet its imagery points toward older cosmologies now condemned or forgotten. The keepers of order do not always destroy what came before. Often they domesticate it. They fold it inward, rename it, translate it into acceptable language, and thereby save it in one sense while erasing it in another. Religious history is full of these quiet incorporations. Festivals move under new gods. Sacred springs remain holy under different names. Burial customs persist beneath altered theology. Mythic motifs once linked to stars, seasons, fertility, or ancestral cycles are moralized, universalized, or recast as episodes within a stricter doctrine. The old material does not vanish, but its original context becomes harder to recover. What remains visible is a later interpretation layered over a deeper memory. The result is not fabrication. It is inheritance under supervision, and supervision leaves marks. The same is true in scholarly traditions. Ancient texts were copied because scribes believed they mattered, but the labour of copying is selective. Most things are not recopied forever. Fragile materials fail, libraries burn, political centres fall, languages become unreadable. A manuscript survives only if it continues to pass through communities capable of preserving it. That fact alone gives immense power to institutions that define value. A worldview that sits comfortably within the reigning order gains shelves, teachers, and commentary. One that does not may slip into obscurity even without explicit persecution. Silence is often produced less by dramatic censorship than by the quiet starvation of transmission. This should unsettle the modern imagination more than it often does. Official history is commonly presented as though it emerged by gradually improving access to evidence. In part, this is true. Archaeology, philology, genetics, geology, and critical historiography have all widened the field, but they have widened a field whose boundaries were drawn long ago by religious authority, imperial inheritance, linguistic survival, colonial collecting, and academic convention. Modern knowledge has corrected many distortions while unconsciously preserving others. What counts as a serious source, a fringe claim, a foundational civilization, a peripheral culture, a legitimate chronology, or a speculative excess? None of these categories is entirely free from historical power. That does not mean all marginalized ideas are true. Many are not. Error and fantasy flourish easily where certainty is thin. Yet institutional confidence can also harden into blindness. When a framework organises careers, funding, prestige, curricula, museums, and national identity, it becomes difficult to notice how much of the human past has been arranged to fit the shape of that framework. The missing chapter may therefore remain missing not because no one senses it, but because the available structures of validation are built to prefer smoother stories. The keepers of memory have always had reasons to prefer smoothness. Stability depends upon intelligible origins. States do not like abysses behind them. Religions do not easily welcome the possibility that their sacred vocabulary rests atop much older systems of meaning. Empires do not enjoy admitting that those they conquered may have carried memories or knowledge more ancient than imperial order itself. Even modern secular institutions, for all their methodological rigour, are not immune to narratives of progress in which humanity rises from simplicity toward complexity in a sequence tidy enough to teach. A deeply broken prehistory, full of lost continuities and repeated reductions, is harder to package. It resists the clean dignity of textbooks, and yet the evidence of selection is everywhere once the eye adjusts. Whole archives known only from references in surviving works. Philosophical schools preserved through hostile summaries by opponents. Indigenous cosmologies recorded only after conquest, already filtered through missionary grammar. Ancient languages reduced to fragments because no chain of teaching remained unbroken, long enough to carry them forward. Sites excavated under assumptions that privileged monumental centres while ignoring perishable or coastal lifeways. What appears as emptiness in the record often turns out to be the shadow cast by institutions that preserve themselves better than what they replaced. The missing chapter of history may therefore involve not only disaster and time, but curation. Human beings do not merely inherit the past, they administer it. They trim it, rank it, sanctify it, and sometimes imprison it in categories too narrow for what it once was. A temple selects, a court selects, a church selects, an empire selects, an archive selects. A museum selects, a university selects. Even silence in such a world begins to look less natural than it first seemed. There is a melancholy in that realization. It suggests that the earliest and perhaps most important layers of the human story may have reached later ages only through guardians who could not help remaking what they touched. The fragment arrives, but the frame around it is younger. The symbol survives, but its meaning has been disciplined. The site remains sacred, but the sacredness has been reauthored. The archive is real, yet the road leading into it has been paved by power. And if the keepers of memory have always shaped what later people are allowed to call the past, then another uneasier thought begins to take form. Perhaps the greatest chapter of human history was not simply lost in catastrophe or dissolved in myth. Perhaps it was inherited in pieces, then gradually reorganized by temples, courts, and systems of knowledge until the original outline could no longer be seen. If so, then what would happen if one looked past the official caretakers of memory and began asking what exactly they were trying to preserve and what they could never allow to remain whole? What power cannot fully preserve, it sometimes destroys with intention. Not always in fire, though fire is the image history remembers best. Not always in decrees, though decrees have done their quiet share. Sometimes destruction arrives dressed as correction. A text is not burned, only deemed impure. A shrine is not erased, only rededicated. A language is not forbidden, only displaced by the language of prayer, law, administration, or prestige. A people is not silenced, only taught to repeat a different account of themselves until the old one begins to sound strange even in their own mouths. This is how whole worlds fade without requiring a single dramatic moment of annihilation. By the time later historians come searching for the beginning, they often find only the clean surface left behind. There is something deeply human in the urge to reorder the past. Chaos behind the present is difficult to govern. A broken lineage weakens authority. A sacred geography shared with older rival traditions threatens purity. Competing memories make obedience fragile. So institutions, once secure enough, tend to simplify. They streamline dissent. They clarify doctrine. They remove ambiguity where ambiguity once allowed many layers of inheritance to coexist. In that process, the past becomes easier to teach, easier to defend, easier to weaponize. It also becomes thinner. This thinning has happened again and again. Conquerors have broken stele and replaced royal names. New dynasties have chiselled older rulers out of stone as though absence itself could become proof that they never mattered. Religious transformations have absorbed sacred places while condemning the cosmologies that once animated them. Libraries have vanished not only through accident, but through wars whose purpose included the destruction of a people's way of remembering. Colonial systems catalogued local knowledge while simultaneously undermining the conditions that allowed that knowledge to live. Modern states standardized education and national heritage in ways that often elevated one line of memory while flattening many others. Each of these actions leaves more than a political effect. It leaves a historical illusion. The illusion is that the surviving narrative is the natural one. Yet natural narratives rarely require so much pruning. When a tradition must repeatedly suppress rival memories in order to look seamless, the seams do not truly disappear. They merely retreat beneath the surface. One can often sense them in the surviving material itself. A sacred text preserves echoes of older gods in the grammar of its metaphors. A monumental city stands atop the bones of earlier sanctuaries whose names are no longer spoken with respect. A theological world picture quietly carries astronomical or agricultural residues from a much older relationship to landscape and season. A canonical origin story gestures toward migrations, conflicts, marriages, and assimilations more complex than doctrine later preferred to admit. Sometimes the old chapter survives most clearly in what later authority tries hardest to discredit. The term heresy, for example, is rarely only theological. It often marks the survival of rival memory. A condemned teaching may preserve fragments of cosmology older than the orthodoxy that defeated it. A folk practice dismissed as superstition may be the worn remnant of a once central ritual order. A local story treated as childish legend may contain the last compressed memory of a place, event, or continuity that official history learned to ignore. This does not mean every rejected tradition is a hidden treasure. Many are distorted, opportunistic, or newly invented. But the category of what is excluded is never neutral. It tells a story about who won the right to define reality. And definition is a form of conquest all its own. Even writing, that beloved instrument of preservation, can become an accomplice to loss. Once a culture moves from plural memory to authorized text, fluid traditions begin to narrow. What was once performed differently from valley to valley, coast to coast, clan to clan, may be fixed under one sanctioned version. The sanctioned version survives magnificently. The others disappear. Future ages praise the miracle of preservation, often without noticing the field of silence it created around itself. The surviving manuscript becomes a monument. The vanished alternatives become unknowable. This is one reason the missing chapter of human history may not lie only in material ruins, but in version control. The human story has been told and retold by institutions with very strong preferences about beginnings, legitimacy, purity, and dissent. What they could not erase completely, they often reframed. What they could not reframe, they marginalized. What they could neither marginalize nor absorb, they denounced. Over centuries, this produces a peculiar result. The past remains present everywhere, but rarely in its original arrangement. Consider how many ancient centres are known through the lenses of later powers. A temple complex survives because a conquering empire reused it. A myth survives because a later religion absorbed it under new names. A people's origin story survives because a hostile chronicler found it worth recording as an example of error. Entire lineages of knowledge may reach the present only as accusations against themselves. What survives is real, yet bent. It speaks, but in the grammar of those who overruled it. Recovering anything older from such material requires listening not only to what is said, but to the pressure of what has been forced into disguise. Disguise is one of history's great preservatives. It allows old material to pass through dangerous centuries unnoticed, or at least tolerated. A sacred mountain becomes associated with a new saint. An older seasonal rite becomes a local feast day. An ancestral story hides inside a later pilgrimage. A cosmological symbol, once dangerous, becomes decorative. A technical memory becomes mythic. A traumatic event becomes moral allegory. By the time scholars encounter these forms, the original layer may be so thoroughly clothed in later meanings that any attempt to peel it back seems speculative. Often it is speculative, but not always empty. Beneath the visible painting, older pigments sometimes remain. The missing chapter may therefore exist not in one hidden vault, but in thousands of overwritten surfaces. That possibility carries both hope and unease. Hope, because loss may not be total. Unease, because recovery becomes difficult beyond measure. One must work through debris, ideology, and reinterpretation. One must accept that no pure original may still be accessible. The ancient world that mattered most may reach the present only in fragments embedded inside the languages that replaced it. If so, then the search for the missing chapter is not the search for one dramatic revelation, but for patterns of erasure repeated across regions and ages until the original continuity became almost impossible to see. And this is where the question grows sharper. If conquest, orthodoxy, empire, and institutional knowledge have repeatedly rewritten the record, not inventing the past from nothing, but rearranging it until it served the needs of the present, then how much of what humanity calls ancient history is actually a stabilized aftermath? How much of the earlier story survives only as sanctioned residue, the tolerated remains of something once wider, older, and more difficult to control? The thought lingers because it touches more than archives. It touches identity. Civilizations tell origin stories not only to explain where they came from, but to justify what they are. To discover that those stories may stand atop older silenced worlds is not merely an academic disturbance. It is an existential one. It suggests that the foundations of memory are political all the way down. And if whole chapters of the past can be thinned, repainted, and inherited only through the language of those who subdued them, then perhaps the next step is not simply to ask what was destroyed. Perhaps it is to ask how modern history itself decides what counts as evidence when the surviving evidence has already been handled by so many victorious hands. The modern search for the human past often presents itself as a victory over myth. Dust is brushed from bone, carbon is measured, sediment is read, and the earth, so the story goes, finally begins to speak in a language more trustworthy than legend. There is dignity in that effort. Archaeology, geology, genetics, linguistics, and the patient disciplines of comparison have widened the horizon of history beyond what earlier ages could imagine. They have corrected fantasies, overturned cherished errors, and restored long-silenced peoples to visibility, and yet even this search, for all its rigour, does not approach the missing chapter from nowhere. It arrives with tools, assumptions, categories, and thresholds of credibility that shape what can be seen before any trench is opened. This does not make the modern method false, it makes it human. Every age believes, with some justification, that its way of asking questions is clearer than what came before. But clarity is not the same as freedom from structure. The modern historian inherits not only evidence, but a map of what evidence is expected to mean. Sites are classified by familiar stages. Objects are assigned functions that fit existing models. Settlement patterns are interpreted through frameworks shaped by previous discoveries, previous training, previous limits of imagination. Even skepticism, so necessary against exaggeration, can harden into reflex. When something seems to arrive too early, the instinct is often to doubt the date, the interpretation, or the significance before asking whether the underlying timeline might itself be too narrow. This is understandable. Extraordinary claims demand caution. Human beings are drawn to mystery, and the ruins of the past have always attracted projection. There is no shortage of sensationalism, eager to turn every anomaly into proof of hidden empires, forgotten technologies, or impossible visitors. Much of that material collapses under scrutiny, but the existence of excess does not cancel the possibility of blindness. In fact, it can deepen it. Once a field has spent enough energy defending itself against fantasy, it may begin to dismiss discomfort too quickly simply because discomfort resembles the first stage of speculation. The result is a peculiar tension. Modern scholarship knows more than ever, yet often feels uneasy where the evidence refuses to fit the sequence it inherited. The human story is still commonly arranged as a progression from foraging to farming, from village to city, from ritual to administration, from symbol to writing, from local cosmology to structured religion, from fragmentation to complexity. There is truth in this, but there is also a hidden preference for smoothness. The deeper the break, the less comfortable the model becomes. A fractured prehistory full of abandoned experiments, drowned worlds, repeated collapses, and older symbolic systems carried forward in damaged forms is harder to narrate. It resists the elegance of linear ascent. That resistance matters, because it may be exactly where the missing chapter still hides. Archaeology is a science of survival. It studies what endured materially, which means it is always at the mercy of preservation. Stone outlives wood, dry caves outlive humid forests, inland tells outlive coasts claimed by sea, burial favours some social practices over others. Monumental centres survive better than mobile networks of exchange or knowledge stored in memory. A people whose sophistication was built into seasonal movement, ritual performance, astronomical observation, or seafaring skill may leave a thinner material trace than a later people whose power took the form of walls and warehouses. If so, then the visible record will always be biased towards certain kinds of civilization and against others. This bias has consequences. It can make late material evidence look like early human development simply because earlier, more fragile forms vanished. It can make innovation appear sudden when the quieter stages of accumulation are gone. It can elevate certain regions as cradles, not only because they were important, but because their surviving conditions favoured discovery, excavation, and interpretation within existing institutional interests. The map of ancient significance is therefore never only a map of past reality, it is also a map of what survived well enough, drew enough attention, received enough funding, and fit strongly enough within the narrative scholars were prepared to build. Funding itself has a history. Political borders shape excavation. National pride shapes heritage emphasis. Colonial legacies shape where artifacts were taken, how they were labelled, and which civilizations were granted grandeur in the global imagination. Academic prestige shapes what is considered a serious line of inquiry. A site near a canonical centre enters conversation differently from a site in a region long treated as peripheral. A hypothesis that preserves established chronologies is easier to support than one that forces many other conclusions to be revised. None of this requires corruption in the dramatic sense. It is enough that institutions, like all human systems, reward coherence and caution in particular ways. This means the missing chapter of human history may persist, partly because it is difficult to fund, difficult to prove, difficult to publish, and difficult to integrate without destabilizing too many settled arrangements. The Earth does yield surprises. Ancient DNA has revealed interwoven lineages, encounters, and dispersals more intricate than earlier models allowed. Underwater exploration has complicated old assumptions about habitable zones and vanished landscapes. Reassessment of dating methods has, at times, pushed symbolic behaviour, migration patterns, and ritual depth farther back than once imagined. Sites once dismissed as impossible have forced revision. But revision often comes slowly, and not only because scholars are stubborn. It comes slowly because disciplines are ecosystems. One change affects many others. To admit that one chapter begins earlier, or differently, may require rethinking population models, cultural transmission, linguistic timelines, technological assumptions, and institutional teaching. The past is not revised one stone at a time. It is revised at the cost of many interconnected certainties. There is a melancholy in that. The truth may be present in fragments for years before a culture of knowledge is ready to let them form a new picture. Meanwhile, the public often oscillates between uncritical wonder and total distrust, making careful revision even harder. Scholars fear being mistaken for fabulists. Fabulists exploit scholarly caution as evidence of suppression. In the space between them, the earth remains patient, continuing to hold what it holds without concern for the reputations of those who interpret it. Perhaps that is why the most important chapter of human history still feels near and far at once. The evidence may not be absent. It may simply be distributed in forms too awkward for a single field to gather cleanly. A sediment core here, a mythic pattern there, a submerged plain elsewhere, a ritual continuity in one region, an unexpected genetic signal in another, a monument whose official date explains less than it should. No one fragment compels a revolution, but taken together, they create pressure. They suggest that the oldest human story may not be recoverable through one method alone. It may require a listening broad enough to accept that symbolic, material, ecological, and institutional traces all preserve different dimensions of loss. And that brings the search to an uneasy threshold. If modern history is shaped not only by evidence, but by the habits, incentives, and blind spots of the systems that interpret evidence, then the missing chapter may remain hidden, not because it has left no trace, but because the traces fall between categories. They are too archaeological for myth, too mythic for science, too ecological for traditional history, too historical for geology, too controversial for textbooks, and too incomplete for certainty. Still, incompleteness is not emptiness. A broken pattern can be real before it is fully understood. A silence can be structured. A field of scattered clues can point toward a continuity no surviving institution preserved whole. The question is no longer only what was lost in the deep past. It is also what the modern mind is trained not to assemble. And if the most important chapter of human history survives only in fragments spread across disciplines that do not easily speak with one voice, then what happens when those fragments begin, however faintly, to form a shape that the official sequence was never built to hold? Some clues do not announce themselves as revelations. They appear small at first, almost too small to matter. A tool found where no one expected it. A burial older than the theory prepared to allow. A symbol that appears in one region, and then, in altered form, in another far beyond the easy reach of coincidence. A genetic trace that refuses to stay within neat geographical boundaries. A trade material turning up far from its presumed home. A memory pattern surviving in two traditions with no comfortable explanation for how either received it. None of these things, on their own, are enough to overturn history. Yet history is not only changed by monumental discoveries. Sometimes it's changed by accumulation, by the slow pressure of details that continue to survive revision. This is where the past becomes quietly difficult again. Modern people are often drawn to grand mysteries because they promise dramatic resolution. A lost city, a hidden archive, a single forbidden truth. These are emotionally satisfying shapes. But the deepest disturbances in history seldom arrive in such elegant form. They arrive as clusters of unease. They gather at the edges of established models. They force one question, then another, until the structure that once seemed stable begins to feel provisional. The most important missing chapter of human history, if it exists, may not be recoverable through one discovery because it may never have been one thing. It may persist instead as a pattern of disobedient evidence, scattered across time and geography, refusing to stay inside the boundaries assigned to it. There are many kinds of such clues. Some belong to movement. Human beings appear in places earlier than expected, crossing distances once thought implausible for their age. The old assumption that ancient populations moved only slowly, cautiously, and within narrow ecological constraints has been repeatedly challenged. In its place there emerges an image of a species far more adaptive, more experimental, and more capable of navigating difficult environments than earlier generations of scholarship preferred to imagine. The map of human dispersal grows more tangled the closer it is examined. Coasts, islands, deserts, mountain corridors, river systems, all seem to have hosted forms of ingenuity whose depth is still not fully measured. Other clues belong to exchange. Materials travel. Obsidian, pigments, shells, metals, and ritual objects appear far from their sources. Such movement does not always imply vast centralized systems. Trade can be indirect, cumulative, and episodic. Yet even modest exchange across long distances changes what a people can know. It carries not only goods, but stories, techniques, symbols, and assumptions about the world beyond the horizon. If early humans were connected through chains of contact more often than older models supposed, then the development of complexity may not have been as isolated as once believed. A world with intermittent but meaningful contact behaves differently from a world of sealed cultural compartments. Then there are clues of continuity, perhaps the most haunting of all, a ritual gesture that remains after its explanation has faded, a sacred orientation repeated across centuries, a cosmological pattern that survives in art, burial, architecture, and story long after its original landscape has changed. Continuity is hard to interpret because humans do converge. Similar minds under similar skies may arrive at similar symbols: serpents, suns, mountains, mothers, underworlds, floods. These belong so deeply to human experience that one must resist the temptation to see inheritance in every resemblance. And yet resemblance is not always trivial. Sometimes the persistence of a pattern feels too disciplined, too spatially embedded, too structurally specific to dismiss as mere coincidence. A spiral cut into stone may mean little by itself. A spiral linked to burial, to orientation, to calendrical rhythm, to seasonal return, and to parallel forms in distant traditions, begins to create another kind of question. Not certainty, but pressure. The same is true of genetic evidence, whose quiet force has been among the most destabilizing in recent decades. Human ancestry no longer appears as a simple branching tree. It resembles something older and stranger, a braided set of encounters, absorptions, survivals, disappearances, and returns. Populations long assumed separate turn out to have mingled. Others thought direct proved more layered. Ancient interbreeding, migrations, and demographic replacements complicate the moral comfort of clean origins. This matters because history has always loved singular beginnings. Genetics has a way of dissolving those. It reveals not a species marching in one file toward civilization, but a world of recurrent mixture, fragmentation, and contact. A missing chapter would fit such a world more naturally than a single clean dawn. Some clues belong to time itself. Dates slip, thresholds move backward, symbolic behavior appears earlier. Ritual care for the dead deepens. Artistic intentionality becomes harder to reduce to late cultural refinement. This does not mean the old story is worthless. It means the old story begins too late. The development of consciousness, social abstraction, and memory-bearing behaviour may reach much deeper into the human past than official chronologies once admitted? If so, then the question ceases to be when humans became civilized in the narrow sense. The real question becomes when humans became capable of carrying worlds inside symbolic form, and how many of those worlds vanished before they could enter durable record. And there are the anomalies that remain contested enough to irritate everyone, sites with disputed dating, structures whose human modification is debated, artifacts interpreted one way by cautious specialists and another by those eager for revolution. These cases are often frustrating because they cannot bear the weight enthusiasts place upon them, yet they also resist easy dismissal. They live in the grey zone where evidence is incomplete, methodology is stretched, and interpretation becomes almost a referendum on temperament. Some scholars see warning signs of overreach. Others see the protective reflex of an orthodoxy too invested in sequence. Both can be wrong. Both can also be partly right. Perhaps that is why the missing chapter remains so elusive. It does not live only in the proven. It also lives in the unresolved. A civilization comfortable with ambiguity might allow such unresolved clusters to remain generative, but modern intellectual culture often demands sharper closure. Claims must be verified, refuted, or set aside. That is methodologically understandable, yet the deep past may not always cooperate. Some of its most meaningful traces may survive only in forms that can never be entirely secured, only weighed, compared, and felt in relation to one another until a broader pattern begins to emerge. That broader pattern, if one dares to stare at it long enough, is unsettling in its restraint. It does not say that every ancient wonder conceals impossible technology. It does not require hidden masters guiding all civilizations from behind the curtain. It says something quieter and perhaps more credible. It suggests that early humanity may have been older in mind, more connected in experience, more adaptive in movement, and more vulnerable to loss than the simplified sequence of official history has usually allowed. It suggests that what later ages took to be origins may often have been survivals. It suggests that the clues already exist, but that they point not toward one secret kingdom or one grand suppressed revelation. They point toward a deeper human antiquity whose coherence was broken before history learned how to keep it. And that may be the most haunting clue of all. Not the presence of some impossible artifact, but the repeated sense that human beings keep finding signs of themselves already in motion, already symbolic, already searching, already bearing traces of interrupted continuities. As though the species, wherever it finally becomes visible to modern certainty, has already arrived from somewhere older than the record is willing to call home. If these scattered clues truly belong together, then perhaps the missing chapter is not hiding at the margins anymore. Perhaps it has been touching the official story all along, like roots beneath stone. The question is whether those roots lead merely to a longer prelude, or to a forgotten human world whose outline still survives in fragments too patient to disappear. If the missing chapter of human history survives anywhere with unusual persistence, it may survive in patterns the human mind keeps repeating, even when the original reason for those patterns has gone dark. A civilization may lose a coastline, a language, a priesthood, a calendar, a royal house, and still carry forward certain shapes of meaning. They return in symbols, in architecture, in funerary habits, in the grammar of myth, in the way sacred space is divided, in the way time is imagined not as a straight line but as a breathing cycle of rise, fall, return and forgetting. Such continuities are difficult to prove in the strictest sense, because symbols travel in more than one way. They can be inherited, they can be reinvented. They can emerge independently from the shared conditions of being human beneath sky, death, weather, hunger, and wonder. And yet there are moments when repetition begins to feel heavier than coincidence. This is where the search becomes less archaeological and more atmospheric. Across widely separated civilizations, certain images recur with almost unnerving loyalty. the mountain at the centre of the world, the tree or pillar joining heaven, earth, and the underworld, the serpent as guardian, adversary, wisdom-bearer, or force of renewal, the sacred flood, the lost island, the age of greater nearness between humans and divine order, the buried king, the sleeping ancestor, the hidden law, the chamber beneath the world, the stars as a script no longer fully remembered. None of these motifs belongs to one tradition alone. None is rare enough to shock by itself, but taken together and viewed not as decorative myth but as the persistent architecture of memory, they begin to suggest that humanity has long been circling the same absent centre. The absent centre may not be a single event. It may be a condition. It may be the memory of having once lived closer to structures of orientation now fractured, closer to predictable skies, stable coasts, intact oral chains, unbroken sacred landscapes, or forms of knowledge embedded so deeply in communal life that later ages inherited only the shell. Symbols, in this sense, may be the bones of vanished systems. They remain standing after the body of the world that once animated them has decayed. Language carries this mystery in a particularly intimate way. Words vanish quickly over millennia. Sounds drift. Grammar mutates. Entire language families can branch, merge, absorb, or disappear. Yet conceptual residues sometimes outlive vocabulary. Even when names differ, the deep structures beneath them can remain strangely similar. A people may no longer call the sky father or the earth mother in the old tongue, but the pattern survives in ritual and metaphor. A sacred direction retains prestige. A colour remains bound to death or kingship. A numerical arrangement repeats in architecture and cosmology. The visible language changes, but the mind continues to move along channels dug by much older thought. This is why comparative mythology and historical linguistics have always drawn both fascination and caution. They offer glimpses of continuity, but continuity is never simple. A shared mythic structure may reflect common descent, cultural contact, or convergent imagination. A word root may reveal astonishing depth, then suddenly vanish into ambiguity. To those who seek certainty, this is frustrating. To those willing to listen more slowly, it may be one of the most revealing features of the human past. The oldest truths rarely survive in clean declarative form. They survive in pressure, in recurrence, in the way different traditions keep arriving at the same haunted threshold, as though something older than their differences continues to pulse underneath them. One of the most unsettling examples is the persistence of cyclical time. Many traditions, ancient and not so ancient, imagine the world in ages, golden ages, dark ages, worlds before worlds, eras destroyed and renewed. Modernity tends to flatter itself with linearity. It prefers development, progress, sequence, invention. Yet beneath that preference, the older rhythm never entirely disappears. The sense that what rises also falls, that knowledge is gained and lost, that history advances only by repeatedly passing through ruin. This is not the thought of one isolated civilization. It is one of humanity's most durable intuitions, perhaps because it has been repeatedly confirmed. If the species has indeed lived through multiple discontinuities, regional collapses, drowned homelands, lost archives, broken priesthoods, dislocated migrations, then cyclical cosmologies may be more than philosophical elegance. They may be the symbolic residue of lived experience. A world ends, survivors remain. The next world is built from fragments. Centuries later, its priests and poets speak of former ages, not because they possess full records, but because the sensation of standing after something broken has never wholly left the cultural bloodstream. This is where symbols begin to behave like fossils. A fossil does not preserve life completely. It preserves form after life is gone. In the same way, a mythic pattern may preserve a civilizational shape after the original conditions that produced it have vanished. The centre mountain may once have been a real sacred geography later lost or displaced. The flood may encode not one disaster but many, compressed into a recognisable moral image. The world tree may preserve an old way of relating stars, seasons, ancestry and ritual ascent. A sleeping king beneath a hill may reflect the deep hope that what was lost is not dead, only hidden, awaiting return. None of these readings can be absolute, but neither are they arbitrary. They emerge because human beings repeatedly leave behind symbolic condensations of realities too large, traumatic, or sacred to hold in plain prose. And symbols can outlast institutions. A conquering empire may erase a language yet preserve a motif. A new religion may denounce an older cosmology, while unconsciously carrying its architecture forward. A philosophical tradition may rationalize myths it no longer believes, and in so doing preserve their skeleton. A ritual posture survives. A sacred geometry remains. The old world continues in altered dress. To later historians, this often looks like mere ornament or universal archetype. Sometimes it is exactly that, but sometimes ornament is inheritance after amnesia. The missing chapter may therefore be legible not only in ruins or drowned coasts, but in the sheer stubbornness with which human cultures continue to produce the same symbolic arrangements around loss, order, descent, ascent, catastrophe, and return. The question is not whether all these patterns come from one source. That would be too simple, perhaps even childish in its hunger for a single key. The more interesting question is whether they preserve traces of a long prehistorical continuity, so repeatedly broken that no full account survived, only recurring forms of remembrance. This would explain why later civilizations so often seem to stand amid symbols they only partly understand. They inherit sacred centres older than their own doctrines. They orient buildings according to rules whose first cosmological meaning has dimmed. They tell stories whose emotional force exceeds the literal coherence of the surviving version. They build atop mounds already ancient. They pray in places where other gods were once invoked. The result is not deception, but layered time. Official history sees the visible layer and names it. The missing chapter lingers below, not wholly silent, but speaking in forms the official layer no longer knows how to translate. There is a kind of ache in that thought. It suggests that humanity may be haunted less by fantasies of lost ages than by actual residues of them, scattered, altered, half-legible, embedded in the imagination itself. Not enough to restore the vanished chapter in any complete form. Enough, however, to keep calling attention to the emptiness where that chapter should be. And once one begins to treat symbols not as decorative excess but as damage carriers of deep time, another question inevitably follows. If so much of what mattered most may have survived only in coded, ritualized or mythic form, then at what point in the human story did our ancestors become capable of creating such durable symbolic worlds in the first place? And could that threshold itself lie far earlier than the official beginning has been willing to admit? Long before cities rose from river mud, before kings pressed their names into clay, before priests stabilized the heavens into calendars and law, something quieter had already happened inside the human creature. A threshold had been crossed, though no monument marked it, no inscription declared it, no witness stood outside it to say, here, at this precise moment, humanity became capable of carrying invisible worlds within the mind, and yet the evidence, faint but stubborn, suggests that this transformation may be the deepest beginning of all, the true opening of history before history had learned how to write. This is the difficulty with official origins. They favour what can be dated cleanly, excavated cleanly, taught cleanly. A city wall is easier to admire than an inward shift of consciousness. A granary is easier to diagram than the birth of symbolic depth. Writing, architecture and administrative order leave durable traces. Imagination does not. Ritual intention does not. the first time a human being looked at the dead and felt not only grief, but obligation to meaning. Who could preserve that moment? The first time a group marked a place as sacred not because it offered shelter, but because it gathered memory, sky, fear, and belonging into one invisible centre. What material record would necessarily remain? And yet something changed, and changed profoundly. Burials deepen, pigments appear, beads are worn. Bodies are arranged with care. Cave walls receive animals, signs, hands, patterns, and forms that seem to exceed decoration. Repetition enters, symbol enters. Time is no longer merely endured, it is shaped. The dead are not merely left, they are placed. The landscape is not merely crossed, it is charged. At some point humanity ceased to live only among things, and began also to live among meanings. That passage may be more important than any later invention, because everything commonly called civilization depends upon it. Without symbolic thought, there is no sacred law, no historical memory, no mathematical order, no architecture aligned to the heavens, no kingship sanctified by descent, no myth of origin, no philosophical longing for truth. The visible structures of civilization are late expressions of an older interior power. If that is so, then perhaps the most important chapter of human history was not the building of the first city, but the long, dim age in which human beings learned how to think beyond immediate survival and inhabit worlds made partly of symbol, story, relation, and abstraction. This possibility unsettles chronology because it dissolves the comfort of late beginnings. It asks whether the human story in its deepest sense began not when records appeared, but when minds became able to preserve absence, imagine continuity, and place themselves inside a cosmos dense with significance. And if that threshold was crossed far earlier than official history once preferred to admit, then much of what came later may have been inheritance rather than invention. The evidence is imperfect, but its direction is difficult to ignore. Archaeology has repeatedly pushed back the age of symbolic behaviour, complex tool use, long-distance planning, ritual treatment of the dead, and visual abstraction. None of these developments appears as a single miracle. They gather unevenly in places and intervals across a long human becoming. That makes them harder to narrate. There is no simple scene in which modern consciousness arrives fully formed. Yet perhaps that is precisely the point. The most decisive transformation in history may have been gradual enough to evade the storytelling habits of later ages, while still being real enough to shape everything. Even seafaring belongs to this hidden threshold. To cross open water, however modestly, is not only a technical act, it is also symbolic confidence. It requires planning beyond the visible shore, trust in memory, trust in return, trust in patterns of current, season, and star. It implies that the human mind has already become capable of holding an unseen destination as real enough to move toward. Navigation is, in this sense, one of the earliest philosophical acts. It is belief disciplined by observation. It is imagination anchored to repetition. A people capable of crossing marine corridors is already living inside a world of abstractions. The same may be said of ritual. Modern minds sometimes treat ritual as ornamental, as though practical life comes first and symbol trails behind as embellishment. But early humanity may have experienced the order differently. Ritual may have been practical in the deepest sense, a way to bind generations, structure grief, stabilize fear, coordinate groups, mark transitions, encode knowledge, and preserve cosmological orientation in a world where memory could not yet rely on writing. In such a world, the symbolic was not secondary to survival. It was one of survival's most powerful instruments. This makes the missing chapter feel simultaneously more intimate and more immense. It may not consist only of lost coasts, buried sanctuaries, or erased traditions. It may also include the vast unrecorded age during which human beings became the kind of beings who could later produce myths, temples, sciences, genealogies, and sacred texts at all. That age may survive only in fragments, because its primary archive was not stone but behaviour. And behaviour is among the hardest things for time to preserve without distortion. Still, traces remain, the recurring care for the dead, the transfer of materials across surprising distances, the persistence of pigment, the emergence of pattern, the repeated insistence that certain places mattered more than their utility alone would explain. These are not final proofs of anything grandiose, but they do suggest a species already haunted by order, relation, and absence long before it named itself civilized. Absence may be the most important word here. A creature that feels absence deeply is no longer living only in the present. It carries memory. It anticipates return. It mourns. It imagines what cannot be seen. It marks the world so that others may understand later. The capacity to endure absence without losing structure may be one of the first true foundations of history. Once that capacity exists, even a small group around a fire can become a civilization in embryonic form. Not because it has monuments, but because it has invisible continuity. If so, then the first chapter of history may not have been about power at all. It may have been about interior expansion, about the slow emergence of minds able to hold both reality and representation, both landscape and meaning, both death and permanence. Everything later, agriculture, kingship, writing, empire, would then appear not as the dawn of humanity, but as the externalization of something much older. The real beginning would lie farther back, in the dim era when human beings first learned to inhabit symbols so fully that they could survive inside them even when the outer world broke. And perhaps that is why so many later cultures speak as though wisdom was older than the institutions that claim to guard it. Perhaps they sensed, however faintly, that the deepest knowledge did not begin with the archive. It began with the mind's first successful rebellion against oblivion. Once that thought enters the story, another follows behind it with quiet force. If humanity became symbol-bearing, memory-bearing, future-bearing far earlier than official history once allowed, then perhaps the missing chapter is not only the record of lost worlds. Perhaps it is the record of an older human maturity altogether, one that later civilizations inherited in fragments, formalized imperfectly, and then mistook for their own beginning. If that is true, then the next question becomes impossible to avoid. What happens when a species capable of such depth suffers not one loss but many, and begins rebuilding again and again from the broken remains of minds that were already fully awake? Once a species becomes fully capable of memory, symbol, ritual, and foresight, loss changes its character. It is no longer only biological. It becomes civilizational, even in the absence of cities. A population may survive in body while suffering a wound in continuity. Knowledge can be severed from the environments that shaped it. Sacred geographies can vanish. Trained memory keepers can disappear. Techniques refined across generations can become useless in a new climate, on a new coast, beneath a different sky. When this happens, humanity does not begin again from nothing. It begins again from fragments. And fragments, however precious, do not carry the whole shape of what was. This is what makes the idea of civilizational reset both seductive and difficult. In its crudest forms, it becomes fantasy, a single lost super-civilization, total in reach and impossible in accomplishment, wiped away in one majestic catastrophe and then hidden by modern institutions for reasons too vague to withstand scrutiny. Such stories are emotionally powerful because they restore drama to the beginning. They offer one hidden key, one master ruin, one revelation worthy of the species' longing for grandeur. But the real past, when it is most haunting, tends to be more broken than that, and therefore more convincing. A reset need not mean universal amnesia in a single instant. It may mean repeated reductions of complexity, repeated thinning. Repeated moments in which a people who knew more than their descendants were able to preserve lose the conditions that made their knowledge coherent. This can happen locally, regionally, even continentally, without leaving behind a mythically perfect Atlantis. It can happen through sea level rise, prolonged drought, ecological collapse, invasion, epidemic, volcanic winter, trade fragmentation, or the slow disintegration of the institutions that once held memory together. The result is not a blank world. It is a diminished one. History already provides smaller versions of this pattern in plain view. Empires fall and literacies contract. Roads decay, and distant provinces become strangers. Technical skills disappear because the social web that sustained them has broken. Temples are abandoned. Legal vocabularies vanish. Fields go untilled where irrigation once seemed eternal. Later generations inhabit the remains and invent explanations for structures they no longer know how to reproduce. Sometimes they mythologize them. Sometimes they quarry them for stone. Sometimes they kneel in them without understanding the language once spoken there. The process is tragic, but not mysterious. It has happened many times within recorded history. The unsettling thought is that if this can happen where texts survive, then it could have happened far more completely in earlier eras where writing was absent, fragile, or restricted to only one thin layer of social life. This is the point at which prehistory begins to look less like a long waiting room before civilization and more like a field of broken recoveries. Perhaps there were many thresholds crossed, many local flowerings of knowledge, many regional orders that became stable enough to shape memory deeply, but not stable enough to leave durable stone in every case. Perhaps the human story before official history was not primitive uniformity, but repeated experiments in living, orienting, remembering, and sacralizing the world. Experiments often reduced before later ages could inherit them whole. A reset, then, is not the end of everything. It is the violent narrowing of inheritance. That phrase matters. The narrowing of inheritance. A people after catastrophe does not inherit the full world of its ancestors. It inherits selected remnants. A story, but not the full context. A ritual, but not the reason for every gesture. A seasonal skill, but not the broader cosmology that once framed it. A building technique, but only where the right materials still exist. A sacred prohibition, now detached from the landscape that first made it meaningful. A fear, a reverence, an image. Enough to continue, not enough to remember entirely. This could explain why later civilizations so often behave like heirs who do not know the full contents of the estate they have received. They preserve orientations, numbers, cosmic hierarchies, flood memories, sacred mountains, underground chambers, world ages, and myths of recovery. They build impressive systems, but often speak as though wisdom was greater once. They codify what remains, yet their own texts sometimes imply that they stand after a fall rather than at a dawn. The present order appears dignified, even radiant, but beneath it lingers the sensation that something was carried forward damaged. One might object that such feelings are universal and prove little. Human beings are nostalgic animals. They imagine golden ages even when none existed. That is true, and it must remain true if the inquiry is to stay honest. But nostalgia alone does not explain the material patterns of loss already visible in history and geology. It does not explain drowned coasts, abandoned ritual landscapes, disrupted migrations, truncated lineages of transmission, and recurrent civilizational contraction. The emotional tendency toward lost age narratives may indeed exaggerate reality. It may also, at times, be responding to it. There is also a moral comfort in linear progress that makes reset theories especially difficult for modern minds to handle. If history rises in a mostly upward line, then humanity may imagine itself as increasingly secure, increasingly knowledgeable, increasingly beyond the fragility that governed earlier ages. But if the past is marked by recurrent thinning, if knowledge can be lost faster than it is recovered, if complexity can collapse, if long continuities can break without warning, then the present becomes less triumphant. It becomes contingent. It begins to resemble another layer rather than the final one. This may be why the notion of reset attracts both careful thinkers and reckless fantasists. It touches something real, the instability of memory-bearing systems. But where careful inquiry stops at evidence, fantasy leaps toward total explanations. The challenge is to remain with the real instability without filling the gaps too quickly. The missing chapter of human history does not require one grand civilization hidden behind a curtain. It requires only the admission that human depth and human fragility have coexisted from the beginning, and perhaps fragility is the true constant. Once humans learned to hold worlds inside symbol, every subsequent loss became more than practical. A drowned coast was also a drowned cosmology. A broken migration chain was also a broken story of origin. A dead priesthood was also a dead method of measuring time. A climate shift was also a spiritual disorientation. Resets, under this view, are not merely economic or demographic. They are ruptures in the invisible architecture by which a people knows where it stands in relation to the dead, the living, the land, and the sky. This makes the surviving fragments more poignant. A myth of renewal may be a scaffold built after collapse. A temple alignment may preserve a sky relationship older than the theology later attached to it. A recurring image of former ages may reflect not fantasy, but the repeated human experience of rebuilding from remains. The species may have become historical precisely by enduring such reductions over and over, each time carrying forward enough to persist, never enough to remain unchanged. If so, then the most important missing chapter of human history may not be one chapter at all, but the long sequence of worlds partially lost before the current world learned to call itself the first. Later civilizations would then be less like founders and more like survivors with exceptional administrative confidence. They wrote themselves into the role of beginnings, because the evidence of what came before them had already been narrowed by catastrophe into forms too broken to argue back. That possibility is difficult to sit with because it does not flatter anyone. It does not flatter the ancients with impossible perfection, and it does not flatter the moderns with secure superiority. It presents humanity as something more fragile and more enduring at once, a species repeatedly injured, repeatedly creative, repeatedly forced to rebuild meaning from incompletion. And if that is true, then another question emerges from the ruins almost by itself. If what later ages inherited was already narrowed by repeated resets, then perhaps the greatest error in official history is not that it forgot one lost kingdom, but that it mistook a survivor's world for the original one. If so, what would the human story look like if its true beginning were reconstructed not from what endured best, but from what had been reduced, scattered, and forced to start again? By now, the missing chapter no longer resembles a single room in the mansion of history. It does not sit behind one sealed door, waiting for a fortunate hand to lift the latch and flood the corridor with simple revelation. It has become something stranger than that. It resembles a pattern glimpsed in fragments. A drowned coast here, a ritual continuity there, a myth of former ages in one culture, a buried sanctuary in another, an interrupted chronology elsewhere, a symbolic grammar that survives conquest, a scientific anomaly too modest to shock on its own, yet too persistent to disappear. The deeper one goes, the less likely it seems that humanity is missing one great, secret kingdom. The more likely possibility is harder to dramatize and therefore harder to dismiss. The species may be missing the connective tissue between many damaged worlds. That changes the shape of the search. For centuries the imagination has preferred singular lost places, Atlantis, Eden, the first city, the mother culture, the hidden archive. Such images satisfy a desire for narrative economy. They promise that complexity can be resolved into one source. Find the source, and everything else will fall into place. But the real human past may not be merciful enough to offer such elegance. It may be mosaic rather than monument. A chain of coastal societies erased by rising seas, interior ritual landscapes fragmented by climate change, early systems of exchange reduced before they hardened into empire, symbolic inheritances carried unevenly by migrating peoples, oral memories absorbed into later priesthoods and rewritten under new doctrines, local civilizational experiments that never expanded widely enough to dominate the record, yet shaped descendants more deeply than the record can now show. If this is true, then the greatest omission in official history is not one missing object, but one missing relationship, the relationship between scattered remnants that no single surviving institution preserved together. This would explain why the evidence feels both abundant and frustratingly incomplete. There are enough fragments to create pressure, not enough to impose closure, enough to sense that later civilizations inherited from older depths, not enough to reconstruct a unified prehistorical world in precise detail. The searcher is left with a peculiar burden. He cannot honestly claim final proof. He also cannot honestly return to the old comfort that nothing important is missing. The field between those two positions is where the missing chapter breathes. Perhaps this is also why the most haunting materials are rarely the most spectacular. A grand ruin invites awe, but it can also trap the mind in a single place. A pattern spread across myth, geology, seafaring, burial practice, symbol, and institutional memory is less cinematic. Yet, it may be closer to truth. Human history, after all, was never produced by one centre alone. It was braided from ecologies, migrations, weather, memory, adaptation, exchange, and power. Why should its deepest omission be any less braided? There is a kind of sorrow in that thought. It means no single discovery is likely to return the full lost chapter to the light. Even astonishing finds may only sharpen the outline of what remains beyond reach. A drowned settlement can testify to vanished coasts, but not by itself restore the world view of those who lived there. A ceremonial site can prove early complexity, but not explain every thread of symbolic continuity later cultures carried forward. A myth can preserve the shape of loss, but not the geography in which the loss first occurred. A genetic pattern can reveal ancient contact, but not the stories those populations told about one another. Every fragment illuminates and withholds at once. This withholding may be the deepest lesson of all. The modern imagination often assumes that truth, once found, comes assembled. But the ancient world does not return in finished form. It returns as pressure, partial structure, disturbed assumptions. It returns by forcing the present to admit that it has mistaken durability for priority. Stone survived better than memory. States preserved themselves better than fragile coast worlds. Canonical texts survived better than local rituals. Dry caves preserved better than humid forests. Imperial narratives travelled farther than the stories of the peoples they absorbed. The visible record is therefore not false, but it is profoundly uneven. To read it as total is to mistake the winners in the struggle of preservation for the authors of all that mattered. Once this is seen, even familiar categories begin to fray. Prehistory sounds too empty for a human world already dense with symbol, mourning, navigation, and inherited cosmology. Civilization sounds too narrow if applied only to literate urban state-based societies, while excluding earlier systems of orientation and continuity that may have been fully civilizational in mental depth, if not in bureaucratic scale. Myth sounds too dismissive for stories that may preserve emotional and structural memory after factual detail has decayed. Origin sounds too clean for a species repeatedly shaped by interruption. What emerges instead is not a neat replacement narrative, but a different sensibility. One begins to treat the past less as a staircase, and more as a ruined city seen through fog. Towers rise here and there, courtyards can be guessed at. Streets do not all connect anymore. Some structures belong to later rebuilding. Others are older than the facades covering them. There are buried foundations beneath visible walls. Open spaces where something once stood now seem natural, only because absence has been there for so long. The city is real. Its present map is not. This sensibility also changes the moral atmosphere of history. If the missing chapter is a web of broken continuities rather than one lost empire, then no single culture can claim to be its sole heir. The inheritance would be scattered by design of catastrophe and time. Traditions dismissed as peripheral might preserve central fragments. Oral memories once treated as decorative might carry deeper continuity than imperial chronicles. Sites long considered secondary might prove crucial precisely because they stand outside the monumental centres that later authors privileged. Even silence becomes evidence, not of emptiness, but of severed relationship. And perhaps relationship is what matters most. A ritual disconnected from its landscape grows opaque. A monument disconnected from the symbolic world that shaped it becomes mute. A myth disconnected from the ecological rupture that gave it emotional force becomes quaint or absurd. Modern disciplines, for all their power, often study these fragments separately. The result is knowledge of pieces without the atmosphere that once bound them together. The missing chapter may therefore remain hidden partly because it was relational in essence. It lived not in one artifact, but in the links between land, sky, memory, death, movement, and authority. Break the links, and later ages inherit items without structure. That structure may never be fully restored. This must remain part of the honesty. There may be no final synthesis waiting just beyond the next excavation. Too much has been drowned, burned, repainted, translated, moralized, and forgotten. But incompleteness does not erase significance. A shattered mosaic still reveals design. The human past may be just such a mosaic, enough surviving tesserae to show that the official picture is too simple, not enough to redraw every missing face. And yet one face continues to appear through the damage. It is the face of humanity itself, older in imagination, more vulnerable in continuity, and less secure in its beginnings than modern certainty likes to admit. Not a species rising cleanly from ignorance into order, but one repeatedly carrying order through disorder, repeatedly salvaging meaning from loss, repeatedly inheriting worlds already broken. If that is so, then perhaps the most important chapter of history was never a hidden kingdom at all. It was the long human labour of preserving fragments across catastrophes so deep that later civilizations mistook the fragments for foundations. And if the surviving world is only the latest arrangement of those fragments, then one final unease begins to gather at the edge of the story. Perhaps the greatest danger is not merely that humanity has forgotten its deepest chapter. Perhaps it is that, having forgotten how much has already been lost, it no longer recognizes how easily the next chapter could vanish in the same way. There is a peculiar comfort in believing that the past is finished. Its ruins are catalogued, its kings are numbered, its migrations mapped, its myths assigned to the proper shelves of literature or religion or psychology. The great labour of memory, under this view, has already been done. Humanity may not know every detail, but it knows enough. Enough to teach its beginnings, enough to explain its rise, enough to distinguish legend from fact and fact from fantasy, enough perhaps to move forward without looking back too often into the dark, and yet the dark remains. It remains not because history has failed, but because history, like every human inheritance, is partial by nature. It illuminates what survived well, what was copied often, what stood on high ground, what could be translated, what later powers found useful enough to preserve. Beyond that circle of light there are other things: drowned thresholds, interrupted minds, broken ritual worlds, erased geographies, disciplines that do not fully speak to one another, symbols carrying meanings they can no longer explain, and the quiet but recurring suspicion that the species has mistaken the visible beginning for the true one. This suspicion does not arrive as proof. It arrives as atmosphere. It lingers behind the monuments, behind the flood stories, behind the repeated image of former ages, behind the strange competence of the ancients and the equally strange fragility of everything they tried to keep. What if that atmosphere is not a mistake? What if the reason humanity keeps returning to lost worlds, hidden chapters, vanished wisdom, and interrupted time is not merely that it loves mystery, but that it dimly recognizes itself as a survivor of discontinuity? Not a survivor in the melodramatic sense, standing triumphant above one total cataclysm, but something quieter and more haunting. A creature whose deepest inheritance has been narrowed again and again, until the narrowing itself began to look normal. In that case, the past would not be a completed staircase behind the present. It would be a shoreline after many storms, its original contours altered so often that no living generation could say with certainty what the first outline was. That idea asks something difficult of the modern mind. It asks it to live without the vanity of total clarity. It asks it to see civilization not as the secure summit of a long ascent, but as one arrangement among many possible arrangements, built from remnants, stabilized for a time, and always more dependent on continuity than it likes to admit. The archives feel permanent until they burn. The coast feels permanent until the sea returns. The language feels permanent until the last fluent speaker dies. The sacred center feels permanent until another power rededicates it. The official story feels permanent until one new layer of evidence reveals that what seemed foundational was only the most recent durable surface. Perhaps that is why the missing chapter matters so much, even if it can never be recovered completely. It matters because it changes the moral texture of the present. A civilization that believes itself to be the clear culmination of history behaves differently from one that suspects it may be standing on incompletely remembered ruins. The first grows confident in its categories. The second becomes careful with memory. The first treats loss as something that happened mostly to others, long ago. The second understands that loss is not the opposite of history, but one of its primary engines. There is a quiet humility in that understanding. It does not require surrender to fantasy. It does not ask anyone to believe in impossible machines, hidden empires of total perfection, or secret masters whispering through millennia. It asks for something both smaller and larger. Smaller because it abandons the hunger for one dramatic answer. Larger because it widens the human story beyond the official sequence of surviving institutions. It allows that what mattered most may not have endured best. It allows that the species may have crossed its most important thresholds before the thresholds acquired names. It allows that memory may survive in ritual, in fear, in symbol, in the moral temperature of myth, in the persistence of certain questions, and in the strange ache people feel when confronted with ruins older than the stories they were taught. That ache is difficult to define, yet it may be one of the most honest responses to the past. Ruins do not merely inspire admiration, they create disproportion. A person stands before stone and feels, for a moment, that time is larger than explanation. Something similar happens before the deep unknown of human origins. The mind reaches for sequence and receives fragments. It reaches for certainty and finds pressure. It asks for the first chapter and discovers that the page has water damage, burn marks, overwritten margins, and long stretches where the text was carried only in the body and vanished with it. The loss is frustrating. It is also revealing. It reminds the species that it has never controlled the terms under which it is remembered. And perhaps that is the most human truth of all. Not that humanity built perfectly, or knew perfectly, or preserved wisely enough to save every precious thing, but that it kept trying to hand something forward despite flood, ash, conquest, cold, forgetting, and time. A burial arranged with care, a warning carried in story form, a sanctuary aligned to the sky, a law traced into clay, a myth encoding the memory of former ages, a fragment copied because someone, somewhere, believed the world would be poorer without it. The missing chapter is painful not only because so much was lost, but because what remains reveals how much effort went into resisting loss in the first place. This leaves the story in a different kind of silence from the one in which it began. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of depth. The silence one hears in places where many layers of life have passed through, leaving only a few surfaces visible. The silence beneath museums, beneath temples, beneath continental shelves, beneath stories repeated so often that no one remembers which part was once warning, which part was grief, which part was geography, and which part was prayer. It is possible that the most important chapter of human history still has not been discovered in any complete sense. It is also possible that discovery, in the ordinary meaning of the word, is not what remains to be done. What remains may be listening to the fractures between disciplines, listening to myth without surrendering judgment, listening to stone without assuming stone preserves everything, listening to the sea as archive, to catastrophe as editor, to institutions as curators rather than neutral windows, to symbols as damaged carriers of continuity, to the repeated human intuition that something essential stands just beyond the edge of the preserved record. Such listening does not restore the lost world. It does something quieter. It makes the present less arrogant. It teaches caution before declaring where the story begins, and when the night grows still enough, there is one final thought that settles almost of its own accord. If humanity has already forgotten chapters vast enough to alter its understanding of itself, then the greatest mystery may not be what lies behind the species, but what lies ahead of it. Another age will one day inherit this one in fragments. It will sort through our monuments, our stories, our buried systems, our altered climates, our silent machines, our confident chronologies. It too will mistake survival for significance in some places, and overlook what mattered most in others. It too will stand before gaps it cannot close. Perhaps that future silence is already moving toward the present, just as the old silences once moved toward us. And somewhere, beyond the reach of neat beginnings and finished conclusions, the human story goes on like a lantern carried through fog, glowing, wavering, never illuminating the whole landscape at once, yet still refusing, for reasons older than certainty, to go dark.